Hello, welcome. Welcome. My name is John Williams. I'm here with Soho Editors. I'm just going to give you a little overview of some of the great stuff we can do in Cinema 4D. And just before we get started, I'm just going to ask you if you do have audio or video, if you could just disable that just as I get started. As wonderful it is to see your face, because we've got quite a few people in this webinar. If we're all streaming our video, we're not going to be able to, it may hinder the playback of watching along what I'm going to do. If we were running a Cinema 4D course online, we would start off with having a breakdown of the day. So each of the courses we do online, we break down into 4 sessions. So you can see there's different sessions, little breaks, and we always have a good chunk of Q&A at the end of the day or at the end of sessions to deal with questions as they come up. And in Cinema 4D, we look at lots of different elements to the software. We look at modeling, we look at lighting, we look at rendering. In particular with modeling, we'll look at the traditional methods of point, edges, and polygon modeling, working with things like splines, so taking elements perhaps from Adobe Illustrator and extruding them and lighting them and rendering them, that sort of stuff. Making all sorts of different designs, whether it's for graphics purposes or for product purposes or architectural purposes or just kind of character purposes. And of course, the fun really gets going when we get stuff animating. And so what we're going to have a look at today is we're going to do 2 very quick little demos. And we're going to have a look at jumping into Cinema 4D. First, we're going to have a look at modeling, building stuff in the 3D environment. And then the second one, we're going to have a look at animating. So we're going to jump on over into Cinema right now. And this is Cinema 4D R21. So this is the latest release of Cinema 4D. And I'm not going to give you an overview of the whole interface. I'm just going to show you some of the tools, some of the new tools for being able to create things. Now, traditionally in 3D software, we do most of our work modeling with polygons, and a polygon is effectively just a flat face. So if I just show you that this cube is made of 6 polygons, 6 flat faces that are all stuck together. If I zoom in inside of that, you can see I'm actually inside of the cube. It isn't solid, it's just made of 6 faces, and I can select each one of those faces and kind of delete them just to prove you that's all it is. It's basically 3D objects made out of 2D flat surfaces. And so traditionally that's how we do a lot of modeling. But there is a new set of tools within Cinema 4D that I want to show you, because they can actually be more intuitive, particularly if you're new to the world of 3D. And it's working with what we call volumes. And this little icon here is going to be where we're going to go to create our volumes. If I click on this, it creates a volume builder, which appears over here in the Object Manager. It doesn't have any appearance. We need to put some parametric objects inside of it. And these are our list of very basic parametric or primitive objects that we can take from Cinema 4D. I'm going to take a cube. And as we've seen, that's our 6-sided cube. And the attributes that make up the cube are shown down here. I'm going to leave it as the default, 200 by 200 by 200. And there's our cube. Now I'm going to take this cube, put it into the volume builder. If I click on it and drag it down so it becomes a child of the volume builder, that's now gone into the volumes. And what we see here is what looks like some retro graphics from the 80s. It looks very, very blocky. What the volume builder does is, instead of making 2-dimensional flat polygons, it makes what we call voxels, which are virtual 3D cubes. And in order to process it quickly, the cube size is quite large. If I select the volume builder, I can choose the size of the cubes. These are called voxels. So let's say I bring that down to something like 3, then the cube size is a lot smaller, and that's looking a lot nicer. So this is made of voxels rather than traditional polygons, and that's really useful if we want to merge objects together. So I'm going to take a sphere, And that doesn't have anything to do with the cube until I put it into the volume builder. That's dropped inside the volume builder, and I can't see it because it's right in the center of our world, which is 0, 0, 0 in the coordinates. So I'm going to increase the radius up so we can just see it. Oh, there we go. I'll bring up something like that. Now I can see the volume builder is actually combining these two objects. Now I can add as many objects as I want to the volume builder, and they will be combining the objects together. This sphere, for example, is made up of, if I have a look at down here, I can see the size of its radius. Segments is 16 segments in the radius around it. I can see those segments quite clearly now. It's in the volume builder. So if I increase that, if I double it, for example, to 32, I've got a lot more segments. In fact, I'm going to bring it up to 100. I've got a much smoother looking result. I've got two objects combined together. To see how that's working, if I select the volume builder, I can see here's my volume builder and here's my objects. And like I said, I can add as many objects as I like. And while they're in there, I can still independently move those objects around. So if I select the sphere, for example, I can go move that. So you can see it's moving into the object and out of the object. Now with the volume builder, we've got different methods or different modes. Union is going to combine the objects together. Subtract is going to subtract one object from another. So in this case, if I have the sphere above the cube, it's subtracting the sphere shape from the cube shape, and it gives us this kind of interesting looking result. If I take the cube, however, and put it above the sphere, it will by default always go back to union. So if I say subtract that, now I'm left with these kind of 6 discs. So that's subtracting the cube from the sphere. Actually, what I want to do for this is I'm going to make a dice, and I want its edges to be slightly rounded off. So rather than it just being a nice cube, I'm going to use intersect, and now I've got this result. Of course, if I want to change anything about my sphere, I can select the sphere and play around with the radius. And the same with the cube. I think I'll make the sphere a little bit bigger, maybe something like that. And now I'm starting to see, okay, that's starting to look like a dice in terms of very simple shape. If I hit this button up here, these are all my rendering tools here, and this one here renders to the view. This is the view I'm viewing in the perspective at the moment. If I press this button, it attempts to render to the view, but a voxel is not a renderable item, so we see nothing. In order to make it renderable, I go back up here and I go to the volume mesher, and that's going to convert it to a traditional mesh. So if I create the volume mesher, I'll put the result of the volume builder into the volume mesher like that. And now we can see pretty busy mesh there. But a clean mesh. And now if I hit my render to view, I've now got a render of that. So that's the starting point for our dice, and that's the main shape. What we're going to do now is we want to work on the details. I'm just going to go over to display and turn off these lines. So I want to remove some little dots for where the numbers are on the dice. So I'm going to go, and I can use probably any of a lot of these tools, but I'm going to use the cylinder. Of course, because as soon as I create it, I can't see where it is because it's in the center of the world. So I'm going to grab axis handle, bring that out, and there's the cylinder. And it's facing upwards, which is the Y direction. I'm going to go orientation. I want it to face along the X, which is red. So I'll go plus X. There we go. I'll bring the radius down. I'll try 20 centimeters. I'll bring the height down, bring that down to about 50. And I'm going to go and position that so it slots in something like there. Now at the moment, this is not having any relation to the volume builder. It's in the same scene, but it's not actually interacting with that. So all I need to do is take my new cylinder, drag it down and make it a child of this volume builder. And now you can see it's kind of looks like it's sticking out from the main object there. So back to the volume builder, I'm going to change it from union, which is the default, so it's adding it to it. I'm going to choose to subtract, and I'll just bring that out a little bit. Let me go to my coordinates here and see, or I'll round it up to, let's say, 110. So now I've got, that's obviously the number one little indent for the number one. So I'm going to do that a couple of times. I'm not going to do it on every face here, but to get the idea, I'm going to do maybe 2 on this face. So rather than going up and grabbing another cylinder and doing the same thing again, I can just take this one here. In fact, I'll just rename it to cylinder 0.1. And if I want to duplicate, all I need to do is hold the command key on a Mac or control on PC and drag down. When I see a plus, it's making a duplicate. That's giving me a duplicate. Now the duplicate is in the same place as the original. So I'm just going to go and move it over here. And bring it up there a little bit. You can see once again, because I've duplicated it within the volume builder, it's part of this object, kind of like a kind of chocolate thing at the moment sticking out of it. Of course, I want to once again change its orientation. So this time I want it to be facing along the Z, which is the blue axis. So I'll say plus Z. And of course, I want it also to be subtract. Now, I haven't got it bang in the center there like I really want it. It's roughly in the center. How can I get it much more centered? Well, because everything we make inside Cinema, every time we make an object, it puts it at the center of the world, which is 0, 0, 0. If I want to align something up like this cylinder, I can go to the coordinates and I can see, oh, okay, the X, which is the horizontal, that's a few centimeters off, so I'll put 0, hit return. Okay, now it's on the center of the X-axis, and then the Y, I want to put that 0 as well. And now that's dead center. How far in or out it is, well, I could determine that, but I think on this one here, I was 100 and I might bring it back a little bit. Let's try 105. Oops, wrong way. 115. There we go. And so on this one, I want that to be the same. So I'll be 115. Okay, now I want to actually have the number 2 here. So that's going to require me having the 2 dots at opposite angles from each other. So I'm going to change my view from the perspective view to my 4-way view here. And in my 4-way view, I'm going to go over into my front view down here. And well, if I just take this dot here and put it down roughly around about there, that's kind of roughly where I want it. If I take a look at my coordinates, I'm going to round that up. So maybe from the 0, 0 point on the X and the Y, which is here, I want it to be, say, minus 35 centimeters on the X. And that would make sense to be minus 35 centimeters on the Y. And when I hit return, you see that moves exactly 35 centimeters long, 35 centimeters down. So with that done, I'll take the cylinder, command, drag down to make another copy of that. And this one here, rather than it being minus, I want it to be plus. Well, I don't need to put plus, I just need to get rid of the minus. And now that is up at the opposite end. If I go back to my perspective view, it's almost looking right, except this is extruding rather than being set in. So I'll go and set that also to subtract. And there we go. I'm not going to do any more dots on this, but you get the idea. That's how I can use these objects. I can add as many objects as I want. These are very simple objects, could be more complex, and they can get added to the mesh that I'm building. Now, if I do a little render of that, I can see here the edges look quite jaggedy, and that's often to do with how many segments you've made your objects with. So my segments on my cylinders are 16. One way I can fix this all is using this SDF smooth option. inside of the volume builder. And SDF Smooth is a little bit like blur. So perhaps in Photoshop, you might have an image, you might apply a blur to it and it blurs all the pixels. Well, the SDF Smooth will add a blur to the volume. I can put it anywhere in the stack. So much like an adjustment layer, the objects beneath it in the stack are being affected by it. If I want it to affect everything, I'll drag it up to the top. And I can see my smooth filter is too much. It's too smooth. It's smoothing that off too much. So I'm just going to go to the strength and just bring that down. That's no smoothness at all. Maybe something like that. Maybe about 20, 25, something like that looks nice and smooth. Okay, so there's my object modeled. What I want to look at now is adding some texturing to it and a simple light. Of course, at the moment, that's all I've got, this kind of gray CG looking dice. So let's have a look at how we can add some materials. I could go and make some materials using some colors, but if I want it to look a little bit more detailed, a bit more real, it's always better to use photographic textures or generated materials. And I've got loads of those in my content browser. If I click on my content browser, you can see here I've got a bunch of stone ones I was looking at earlier. I'm going to search for wood. So if I type in wood up here, now it shows me a list of different wood related items. So not all of them are textures or materials. I've got different wood details there. But if I scroll down, oh look, I've got some wooden planks here. I've got some wooden photographic textures. Down here, I've got some objects. So within Cinema, not only do you get a large number of materials and textures that you can use straight out the box, but you've actually got hundreds of pre-made objects, lots of domestic objects like chairs, tables, lamps, stuff that you might use, and lots of them are, you know, quite high level modeling. This one here, not particularly useful. I've got this little thread, and if you wanted to use, you know, if you want to import one of these pre-made models into your scene, you just double click and it pops it in there. Now this is made to scale, so if I move it along, it's actually tiny. If I press O on the keyboard, that just zooms to the selected object, and there I can see there's my little thread. I don't want to use this in my scene, but what I do want is the texture. And so in fact, you can see when I import the object, it's brought in these different materials, the thread materials and the wood material. I don't need the thread ones, but definitely the wood one looks like it could be a good starting point for my wood texture. So I'm going to jump back to the objects manager. And if I take this object and actually just delete it, then the object's gone, but the materials stay inside of my scene. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select my volume measure, which in fact I'll double click and just call this dice. And if I press O on that, I can see that object. And all I need to do to add the material is just simply drag and drop. So I'll take the wood material, drag it up onto the dice, and that's applied the wood texture on there. Now, it may not look particularly high quality at this stage. This is just the viewport setting is relatively low, so it's nice and quick and responsive. But when we render it, we'll see higher detail. But before I render it, I can see I have got a seam down here. When you add a material to an object, you get a material tag. If I click on that, I'll see it. That's the material tag, and my attributes now show me the attributes for this tag. And there's various ways you can apply a material onto an object. It's usually referred to as the projection mapping, how it's mapped over the surface. And if you were using specific objects like spheres or cylinders, you may choose one of those objects. I could choose cubic because this is more or less based on a cube. But if I use, cubic, you can see, or you might just be able to see, I can see these seams where the cube would be joining up. I'm going to go to spatial. That's just going to arrange it over space. I can still see those seams, but I have an option down here to hit seamless. And if I tick on that, that just gets rid of the seams. It basically just mirrors up the texture. and you might notice like up here, it looks a little bit mirrored. But if I don't want to see that mirrored edge, I can go to the offset. So I can offset this texture on the U or the V. So if I grab there and move that up, you can see I move it along. I might just go and hide that there, and I might offset it on the V as well. Let's find a nice bit of grain. So that, yeah, so let's say I'm happy with that. That's my, that's where I want my texture. If I want to render that, instead of rendering it to the viewport this time, I'm going to render it to the picture viewer, because when I render to the picture viewer, it has a history of other things I've rendered, a few things I was rendering out earlier. So now if I make any changes, like let's say I change the angle to over here and zoomed out a bit more, then when I render that, I can now refer to the current render and the previous render. I see before and after, and you know, I can go for an infinite number of renders here, and it just stores them temporarily. So there we can see. So this, being a photographic texture, looks a lot more realistic than if I just added a brown wood texture and tried to add some noise or some grain onto it. But I can make it a little bit better if I go into the material. If I double click on it, that opens up my material editor, and I can see this material is made of two channels: reflectance, which is dealing with, you kind of see it's a little bit shiny there. I'll leave that more or less as it is, maybe bring it down a touch. And then I've got bump, and the bump is controlling how much grain we're seeing on it. Again, in the viewport here, it's only a rough approximation of what it looks like. But if I increase this strength, have a look at what happens. I'll zoom in, you might have a better chance of seeing. Pop that over there. If I bring the strength up to 100, you can see now it's kind of bringing out a texture, and there, if that's a 0, it's just going to be very flat, like a photo mapped over something. But if I bring the bump up, it's using the grain to add tiny little details. If I bring that up here and just, let me just do a little render there so you can see nice and large, you should be able to notice that now the light is hitting the edges as they're being kind of lifted up, and the grain seems to be indented a little bit, and that's going to look much more realistic when it's interacting with the light. Of course, in this scene here, all I've got is a dice. I don't have a light, but when we work with cinema, it adds a default light just so you can see what you're modeling, otherwise it'd be black. But as soon as I create a light in the 3D scene, that becomes the sole source of illumination. So that's what I'm going to do. Before I make a light, though, I want to make a floor object just so I can put it on something. So this option here, this are my environment options, and I want to grab the floor object. Now you notice how that's gone right through the middle of the dice. That's because the dice is made like everything in the center of the world, and it grows out, so the floor is at the center of the world. So my dice, if I select the cube where I made it from, was 200 by 200 by 200. So if I take the dice and move it up by 100, it should now more or less be sitting on the floor, or is perfectly sitting on the floor actually. And so that's much more helpful, because as we add a light now, we're probably going to want to see some shadow coming from it. And we won't see that if it's just hovering in space. So there's our dice. I'm going to add a light. Now there's a whole range of different lights you can use in cinema, but I'm going to use this option here, physical sky. A physical sky, if I create physical sky, it creates a dome. You can see there's a gradient on it. The sky's blue. It creates the main light, which is the sun, which is probably that big bright bit over there. And it also creates a shadow, although I can't see the shadow because while I'm just viewing in my viewport here, it doesn't show shadows by default. So if I go and, or I'll go and render to my standard view, you can see now that's applying that environment light, and it's adding a shadow to it. I'll just spin around a little bit and render to my picture viewer. see what that looks like. So now I can see there is my dice, the indented little number counters, and there's my shadow. And one of the great things about the physical sky, if I select on it, go to time and location, I can move my time around, and you can see if I move it quite dramatically, you can see, oh, the light's in a different place, the light temperature is different. And so now if I render that, I'm going to have the lights much lower, so the shadow is much longer, it's much warmer light, so now I've got really dramatic looking shadow coming off that. I think I might just spin around. Depending on your hardware, you might be able to see shadows real time, so there's various options in terms of what you see, and that's dependent on graphics card. If I say shadow here, on my graphics card, it gives me a rough approximation of the shadow. So if I wanted to see where the shadow is going at this time of day or this time of day, that gives me a rough idea. But really it's only when I render it that I'm going to see it in its kind of full glory. So there we are. So that's basically using volumes to model objects, and once the modeling phase is done, then adding textures and adding lights is what really takes it to the next level, make things look stylized or more realistic. But the fun really gets going when you start animating things. So I'm going to leave this scene here, and I'm going to jump into another scene that I've got set up and ready to go. This is the second scene we're looking at, and in this one we're going to look at animation, but we're not going to do a lot of keyframe animation. We're mainly going to use some inbuilt things in Cinema to get things moving for us. So to start with this, I'm going to go up and create an environment, and last time we created a physical sky. This time I'm just going to create a sky object, and a sky object is just an infinite dome. And the reason it's useful is because you can put a material onto it or a photo. That's what we're going to use. So I'm going to go load in an image, and I've got a bunch of 360 images that I sourced. Most of these I can just get free off the net. I've got this one here I'll use. It's 8K image, so it's 100 megs for a still image. It's pretty big. And when I apply that onto my sky, boom, now I'm now in the car park, because that image is now being wrapped around a 360 sphere. So it's really kind of, you know, it's pretty straightforward to work with that. Although I don't want to be looking at the back of this Hyundai, so I'm going to select the material tag and just offset that a little bit, maybe 19 or 20, just so I'm looking down here. Okay, so this environment's going to be really useful later, because we can use this environment to light the whole scene. So sometimes you want to create lights, sometimes often in integrating, compositing in a realistic sense, you might not want to create any 3D lights. You can just use an environment to create a light, and that's what we're going to do a little bit later, because this photo itself has light sources like these lights here and that window. Sorry, not that window, the daylight over there. So we'll use all of that to light this scene. But before we get into the lighting and making it all look pretty, we're going to do some animation, and we're going to do it with some very simple objects, spheres. So I'm going to create my sphere there, and I just want to bring its radius down to 10 centimeters. So it's tiny. And I'm going to introduce us now to MoGraph, the MoGraph module. MoGraph is short for motion graphics, and there's loads of tools in here for creating both static and moving motion graphics. You can use these tools to speed up modeling as well, but they're primarily developed for motion graphics and animation. And I'm going to grab this one called the cloner. Anything I put inside the cloner will be cloned, so I'm going to put the sphere inside the cloner. And on screen now, you should see I've got 3 spheres cloned on top of each other. So if I change the original, it will change all the clones. And if I go to the clone, I can choose how many clones do I want. I can have more or less. How do I want the clones to be arranged? They're in a linear line at the moment. I could have them in a radial arrangement. show that quickly like that. And I could go and increase the count or the radius, and I could increase, and just change loads of things like this. So some of this might be familiar to kind of After Effects users. It's a little bit like working with shapes, but it's 3D. It's a lot more fun, a lot more intuitive. I'm not going to use a radial array on this one. I'm going to use a grid array. And so I'm going to set my grid up to have a count of 80. So 80 clones on the X, 2 clones on the Y, 2 clones on the Z. So there's hundreds of clones. In fact, they're so wide I can't see them. So I'm going to bring the whole size of this down only to 1,000 centimeters by, what am I going to do, by 10? Let's go by 10 by 10. Okay, so that's whatever the mass is, 80 times 2 times 2 again. That's all the clones I've got in there. And so they're all cloned of the original. I'm just going to set this to render instance because this will save us time when we're animating. Okay, so I want to randomize these. At the moment, they're all the same. If I go up back to my MoGraph module here, I can add these things called effectors, and effectors can be used to change the objects. They can be used often to animate the objects. I'm going to use this randomize one. So random effector, that suddenly randomizes all the spheres. And if I go to the parameter, I can see they're being randomly moved in position on the X, the Y, and the Z. So if I play with the Y value, for example, I could say, oh, I want them to go randomly up to additional 150 centimeters and additional minus 150 centimeters. And I can do the same with all these other properties to randomize them out. But I don't want to do that, so I'll turn off position. I want to randomize their scale, so I'll click scale, and I can randomize the width or the height or the depth. So they're all random like that. Or actually, I'm just going to uniform the scale and say keep the proportions locked. I'll randomize the scale by 1. That means they will randomly scale up to twice the size or half the size. And so you can see I've got loads of spheres now at random sizes between a scale of 1 up or 1 down. Okay, now that's just got them arranged, but what we want to do is we want to add some dynamics to allow us to do some movement. We can do that by selecting on the cloner, which is, these are all parts of the cloner, and go to tags, and I'm going to go to simulation tags. Now with the simulation tags, we can add lots of different dynamics. The first one we're going to do is add in a rigid body. If I select all that, then all the clones now have a rigid body. What does that mean? Well, if I play back, so I'm going to play back my timeline from the beginning. Boom. Okay. So what that means is, because at the very beginning of the timeline, these spheres are all kind of interconnected. Because I've told it to be a rigid body, it says, oh, they shouldn't be locking into each other. They can be touching, but not overlapping. So as soon as I hit play, it's blasting them out. But also dynamics means there's gravity. So once they've finished blasting out, they fall. Now to reduce that, I'm going to go to the force option. If I put that follow position, say to 1, roll that back to the beginning and play, you can see they kind of blast out a little bit, but they more or less stay together. And they're slowly sinking down. I'm going to whack that up to something like 6. And then now you can see they keep together. They're keeping together a lot better. So the follow position is having more effect than gravity, and the repelling motion they've had when they're interlocking. So that's good. Now, if I select on the rigid body tag, everywhere in Cinema 4D where I see this little button, this is where I can keyframe things, so I can enable or disable certain things or keyframe it over time. So in this case, I want the follow position to stay on from the beginning, but then let's go to frame, say 200. At frame 200, I'm gonna drop a keyframe, and then I'll go on a couple of frames, And so a few frames on, I'll bring the follow position down to 0 and click on that. And what's that going to do? Well, it means just the follow position is going to stop. It's going to switch off at about 200 frames. So if I play it back, it follows and then it stops to follow, which means gravity is now taking effect. Now that's all well and good, but really I'd probably want these spheres hitting the floor. So I've actually got a floor object I've already made. I've just turned off its visibility, so I'll enable that. But the problem is they are falling through the floor. So with the floor, I'll go back to my tags. I'm going to go to my simulation tags and grab my second simulation tag, this one called a collider body. Now, collider body, unlike rigid body, will not be affected by gravity, but it will interact with other dynamic objects. So you can see as the spheres drop, they're now hitting that floor and rolling off. Now, at the moment, it's hard to see the rolling because they're all kind of white spheres. So what I can do is I can add some materials to them. And I've made a couple of simple materials here, just basically just some stripes of color, but I've also made them slightly reflective. So we'll see the environment reflected in them. Before I apply them, I do want to make some copies of the sphere. So if I hold Command and drag, select the sphere, Command on the Mac, Control on the PC, drag that twice along. I've got now 3 spheres. Of course, at the moment, they're all identical. But now I can go down to my materials and say, I'll grab this yellow one and put that onto sphere 0.2. I'll grab this blue one, put that onto sphere 0.1. I'll grab this white and blue one, put that onto sphere. And now if I play that back, I can see, okay, I've got a multiple different materials on objects. In this example, I'm just using spheres just because it's the easiest to understand, but they could be different objects. For example, it could have been, it could have been a bunch of pyramids. So let me just bring in a pyramid for a second and scale that down. See what would happen if I had a pyramid in there. Or I've got pyramids and spheres in there, and I could add much more complex objects with other materials on as well. And but I'm just going to go with spheres because it's easier to see. Okay, so there's hundreds of spheres, different textures. Dynamics is running pretty much all the movement there. When they land, they're kind of rolling along and they will eventually stop, but I've only given myself 300 frames on the timeline. Let's have a look at another way we can add some animation to this. I'm going to make myself another sphere. I'll just leave it the default size, and I'll go and add this white material onto it. Now at the moment, when I play this back, the sphere doesn't have any interaction with the little spheres. That's because it doesn't have any dynamics on. So on this sphere, which I'll just rename to master sphere, I'm also going to go to the Dynamics tab, Collider Body, and as soon as I do that, you should be able to see, wait for it to roll back to the beginning. These other spheres are now wrapping themselves around it. They're trying to stay together, but there's this object in the way, and that's really helping. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to grab my move tool, and I can actually, wait till this starts again. I can actually move this in real time. Now, I don't know how smooth that's going to be looking on your screen because obviously it depends on how fast your internet connection is, but I can see here really smooth response time to my movement, and it's dynamics happening real time. And that's because Cinema 4D, when we're in the viewport here, it's doing everything on the graphics card. Now, I've got an iMac 2015, so it's by no means the most powerful or fastest machine or graphics card, but and I've got hundreds of spheres cloning here, but you can see it's a really nice interaction where I can have all this real-time movement. Well, what would happen if I wanted to record that movement real time? Like, let's say I had some music and I wanted to conduct the sphere to move with music. Well, we have a tool built into Cinema 4D under the Animate menu called Cappuccino. And this is going to do a basic form of motion capture. So if I start recording and move the mouse, it's going to move the sphere in real time. It's going to record the movement I've got. If I've got a Wacom tablet, which I have, you often get a slightly smoother movement with that. And this is for After Effects users. This is very similar to Motion Sketch in After Effects. So we're going to do a similar thing. I only want to record the position in this example, so I'm going to turn off scale and rotation because it would just mean there's less keyframes being recorded. And if you were doing things bit by bit, you could do single frame mode, but I'm going to go start real time. And then I'm just going to grab this little right angle here because this is going to allow me to move it left and right and up and down. I don't want to move it forwards and backwards. So as soon as I click and start moving my mouse, my Wacom, it's going to start recording the movements. So I'm not going to play music, but I would imagine there's some music. So I'm going to click and drag, and you can see now it's doing the movement up to about frame 200, and then that's where the dynamics stop. When I take my finger off the mouse button and release, I can see now a motion path. So it's recorded all the movement I did. These are all the keyframes here. And if I look down at the timeline, I can see loads and loads of keyframes, like hundreds of keyframes. And if I play that back, I will see all the movement I did. Really accurately converted into keyframes. Now, if I wanted to tweak that, 250 frames is a lot of frames to tweak. So I can go up to my layout. I'm going to change my layout from my standard layout to my animate layout. And in the animate layout, I can see the dope sheet view, which shows me all the keyframes. I've got my master sphere selected. These are all the keyframes. I can use this button here to zoom to see all of them. And there literally are hundreds. And I want to reduce them. And I can go over to the functions option and simplify. And if I choose simplify, I can simplify them by a value amount or by a time amount. So for example, if I simplified them by 0 value, but time, say, 4 or 5 frames, I say, okay, now it's just simplifying that down to every kind of 5th frame of movement. So rather than having all the fidelity and the wobbly stuff, it's just got the general movement. If I wanted to simplify it down by, in this case, distance, because it's position, I can say, oh, well, if there's anything moving less than, say, 3 centimeters, then just simplify that down. So that's going to simplify it as well. The only problem with doing this is if I jump over into the graph editor here, the F-curves manager, you can probably see, if I zoom in, my graph curves are all linear lines. If you do animation in something like After Effects, you'll know what I mean by linear lines. It just means things are going to move a bit robotically. They're not moving in curves, they're moving in linear arrangements. So I can easily fix that. If I select all those keyframes, I can press this button here. I can say auto tangents, boom, add that. And now I can see both on my graph, but also more importantly up here, I can see everything's now moving in arcs of movement, which is how nearly all organic movement moves in arcs, like human movement, limbs, creatures. So if I play that back, I've now got what I did with the mouse, my Wacom tablet, real time. So I've created lots of movement doing a combination of the Cappuccino motion capture of my mouse and dynamics, which is allowing all these spheres to move and roll and fall. I'm going to just jump back to my standard layout there. So the last thing I want to do is on this is I want to render it. So let me go to a frame when the balls have landed, say here. If I render that quickly out to my viewport, I can see, okay, well, I can see I'm getting a reflection in the sphere of the environment and of all the other spheres, particularly there, you can see that, which is great. But the lighting isn't right at all. It's just using the default lighting. So what I will do is go up to my render settings. I'm going to add an effect called global illumination. And this is going to add a global illumination to the scene, which basically means it's going to use the environment to light everything. And in this case, my environment is this interior of the car park, and so it's going to use the lighter parts of the image as a key light or key source of illumination, and it's going to fill other details in with the other less bright areas. Let me just render that so you can see. That's going to take considerably longer because it's now going to be bouncing light and using the image map. So we'll have a little look at this when that runs through. Now, when it comes to rendering animation and global illumination, obviously this is going to take a lot more time, but I've got one that I've already rendered. So you can see now the lighting should match up perfectly for the environment because the environment is lighting the scene. I'm not going to have to build any lights into this scene. I'm just using the photographic image to light it. It's enhanced on here because I've got a reflective material, just so you can see it's reflecting it. And you can see, because the light is this strip light here, which is directly above it, is lighting it, you can see it's casting a shadow. Each of these spheres have got a little shadow on them as well. So it's integrating very naturally into the shot. The only problem is that the floor is all being lit up in white. And what I want to do is I need to have the floor there so that spheres land on something, and I want to see their shadows because otherwise they won't feel like they're integrated. But I need to somehow make the rest of the floor not visible. And I can do that if I select the floor object, go to tags, go down to render tags, go to this one called compositing. And I've got lots of different options in here. I can turn off an object's ability to cast shadows or to be seen by the camera. In this case, I'm just going to use these options here to composite into the background. And I'll do this one out to the picture viewer, otherwise it may take too long. And this will once again do this phase called the iridescent cache pre-pass, when it works out where all the light is. You can see it's estimating where the light and the shadow is, these little white dots doing that. And once it's done that pass, it can just go through and process the image, and you can see that's now integrated in there. So the shadows, the little reflections, highlights, that's all coming across. And so that's how we can integrate something, whether it's you know, like this, some kind of graphics into a photographic image. It could be much more realistic CGI composites. If I'd made a CGI car and then used this lighting method, that's going to use the actual environment to light it, which sits in much more naturally. And so that's really quite straightforward to do inside of Cinema 4D. So if you're making content or animating content and integrating content, there's lots of tools you can use in Cinema 4D to get that working pretty quick. I'll just try and show you a little quick time of the finished thing there. Okay, so that's how we can work with Cinema 4D to get lots of movement happening without needing to do traditional keyframe animation. So that's basically our two demos that I wanted to show you through, kind of just to show you how we can do some modeling, how we can do some texturing, how we can do some lighting, animating, rendering within Cinema 4D. I find it is the most intuitive 3D app. Over the last couple of decades, I've used all the main ones, but Cinema 4D, because it's got quite a close link to things like Photoshop and After Effects, is a great option, particularly for motion designers. And yeah, it is just much more intuitive. There's lots of fun tools in there to work with. So I'm just going to open it up now. If you've got any questions, we've got a little chat box here. If you're familiar with Zoom, you should be able to find the little chat box. So if you send through any questions you've got, I can see if I can have a go at answering them either verbally or visually. So thanks everyone for tuning in. If you do want obviously more information, contact SEO editors about all the courses that we're doing online. I think I mentioned earlier, we've been doing online courses for about 1.5 years, but for some strange reason, they've become really popular in the last couple of weeks. So all of our courses now online. Yeah, thank you very much for your time. And I shall start having a look at your chat questions now. Okay, one question that's come up. If I just jump back over to my other scene, did I save it? I didn't save it. That's always dangerous. I just save that and collect dice. There's lots of ways to multi-texture things. For example, I can take an object that I've made and I can make it into a mesh, traditional mesh object. And when something's a mesh object, this may not be the best way of doing it with this particular object. But for example, here, I could say, oh, I want to select all of these polygons. Oops, that's not a very good selection. Let me say I want to select all of these ones here. Just going to do it very roughly. So I'm just using my select tool there. I'm painting them. If I want to expand that selection, I can go up to select and I can choose to grow selection. And okay, yeah, grow that a little bit. Maybe I'll do that a couple more times. Grow selection. You get the idea, it's getting bigger. If I wanted to, oops, just missing those ones there. I could take another material like this. Actually, no, let me just make a blank one. I can just drag it on there and now I've manually selected those polygons. So I've done it very roughly, so it's not going to look particularly good, but you can see now I've manually added a material on there. I might say, actually, I don't want it to be white. I want it to be kind of dark gray and not very reflective. So like that. And now I get rid of my grid there. Oops. Now I've been able to add another material onto it. A much more controlled way of doing that would be to breaking it out into a, let me go into my UV edit mode. And when you bring something out into the UV edit mode, you can run through, in this case, I'll just run through the wizard, break it out into a UVW map. And then over here, I can then go and make this object and break it up into a mesh that I'd then be able to much more easily control. If I get probably something like a cube or cubic 1, that would be the way to do it. Let me just select all those polygons. Once I've got it into a mesh, then usually what we'd do is we're going to take that and load that into Photoshop, and then I can start painting on here. So rather than having this hard edge line on here, which is obviously what I'm going to get from Cinema because it's selecting a polygon in Photoshop, I'm going to, rather than probably blend that through and be able to then apply my Photoshop result back onto there. So that's using this method called the UV edit mode. BP means body paint. And that's going to give me a lot more control. So sometimes if you've just got an object like a cube and you want to make the different faces a different material, once it's editable, you can say, oh, that side will be gray and this side will be wood and that side will be something else. Then I can just easily apply different materials to each face. But when you've got something a little bit more molded like that, that's when you're going to want to send it over to body paint to be able to create a flat map that you can then paint inside of After Effects, not After Effects, inside of Photoshop, and then reapply. Okay, hopefully that answers that question. Undo a bunch of times. What else have we got here? Great. Can we get the files? Yes, you can. I can give you the finished files. You'll need R21 if you, for example, this one here. Let me undo. In fact, if I just go and revert. So this one here, you'll need R21 because some of the features I've done on it are unique to R21, and also that texture is an R21 texture, but it would load up in R20, but anything before that, before they had volume builder, you wouldn't have. And the car park scene, I can send you that, although the biggest part of that is probably this car park image, which is 100 megs. So that would be, if I wanted to collect everything, I can go to File, I can say Save Project with Assets. Let me do that. Save Project with Assets. I'll put that on the desktop, car park. And this is like a project collect, basically. That's going to grab everything that was in there. Most of the things was computer generated inside of Cinema, so they're going to be small. Have a look here, car park. There's the scene file, which is a whopping 0.5 meg. There's the texture, which is 100 meg. So if you do want that, then I think we'll probably need to either WeTransfer or put a link on the URL. Oh yes, I said that we would upload it to the website once done. Yeah, okay, so someone at Soho Editors will let you know where a link is where you can get these files and download them. Can you go over global illumination? Is the background have to be HDR? Let's say you're working with one scene tracking. No. Okay, so let me just jump back into Cinema, for example. Haven't you seen? If you're working with global illumination, you don't need to have a 360 environment at all. You could have any sort of environment. For a real quick example, if I create myself a floor, there we go, and I create myself a sphere. Okay, I've not even added any materials to these, but normally if I render that, I will see a sphere and the floor, and it's kind of grey and boring, and there's no real light in there apart from the default light. If I add global illumination to it, guess what I will see? It's surprisingly underwhelming. I see nothing because there's no source of light. So when you're using global illumination, it's essential you have something that creates light. It's down here trying its best to work out the iridescent cache prepass, but it is not going to get anywhere because there's nothing emitting light. Your two main options for emitting light are either A, creating a light. So if I put a light in the scene, lift it up, move it over there. Then if I use global illumination, in fact, I'll just do this to the picture viewer. It'll be a bit quicker. I'll leave that chugging away for a second. So now that's going to bounce the light from one object to another. Gives me that kind of softer looking result. But the other way of doing it, if I just delete that light for a second, is, let me just duplicate this sphere. If I have a material that is self-illuminating, so I'll turn off everything else just so you can see luminance, it's not on. I tick it so it's on. I say, make me a kind of cyan self-illuminating material. If I add that to this sphere, when I now render with my global illumination, look what it's doing, even as it's processing, because this has a luminance level like a light does, this is now going to be illuminating the scene. So although I don't have any light in the scene, this material is a light, almost like it's a light box or an orb or neon. So you can see, hopefully you can see that on your screen, but I can just see a little silhouette because this isn't receiving any light. That's creating light and emitting light, which is falling off over the distance. So you don't need to have a light in a scene for the global illumination to work, but you do need to have at least something that's self-illuminating. And with the car park scene, I hadn't just applied the material to the color channel, I'd applied it to the luminance channel. And now that's illuminating the whole scene. So hopefully that works. Obviously, the fact that it's a 360 image means that my reflections and my lighting are going to be more accurate. But if you only had a flat plate or a 180-degree image, you're still going to get the results. And like I said, if you don't have any 360 photo or image in there, whatever your scene is, you can use global illumination on anything, and it will use self-illuminating materials and lights to bounce the light and give you much softer looking results. So hopefully that is a question. Somebody was saying, there is no redshift for the Mac? Do you use ProRender? Yeah, okay. So this is a big Mac PC question. For lots of people working in 3D world, GPU processing, graphics card processing units processing is the new thing, because it can process things like global illumination and advanced things like depth of field and motion blur much quicker than a processor can. And so the graphics cards that really work well with GPU acceleration are NVIDIA cards, and Macs no longer support NVIDIA. So most of the software like Octane and Redshift that do GPU accelerating processing will not work on a standard Mac. I do believe you can get external graphics card boxes and kind of plug them in to enhance that power. But at the moment, Redshift which is being bought out by Maxon, is not working fully on a Mac until they work out some sort of deal with working out how to use the Radeon system. So you don't get that boost of speed and also all the nice realistic rendering settings you'd get through Redshift. So they've got their own system built into here called ProRender, but it's and it can give you nice quick real results, but it's nothing on Redshift or Octane. What else have we got there? Okay, question about After Effects. Would AE be better for TV digital content, or Cinema 4D just the better option? I can't really answer. I mean, After Effects is the tool to use for motion graphics and two-dimensional work. But After Effects doesn't really handle 3D. It does a bit of 3D extrusion of text, but it's more a cheat. And so the reason why Adobe have teamed up with Maxon to create a very strong link between After Effects and Cinema is because Cinema's got a lot of incredible tools that work very, very fast, and the Adobe has nothing like Cinema in its creative suite. So when you need some true volume, some true 3D, you do need to use Cinema. If you're just doing kind of text and explainer videos, After Effects is going to be quicker. It may not necessarily be that much quicker to build your work, but in terms of when you're rendering 3D and you've got things like depth of field, motion blur, global illumination, you can easily start getting up to like 10, 20 minutes per frame. And for an animation of 30 seconds to 1 minute, that's going to take days and days to render, unless you have a render farm or you're using an online render farm. So After Effects is often the first choice, but more and more animators, After Effects users, are learning Cinema 4D, because you do get to a bit of a limit with After Effects because it is 2.5D, and when you need to have volume, then Cinema's there for you. But also Cinema's got so many of these great motion graphics tools in, stuff that you can actually do stuff in cinema and then render it so it looks 2D. So if you want that more traditional or that 2D or that flat look, you can do it. But the way you can get loads of things animating much quicker in Cinema 4D, again, people are definitely adopting it a lot more. They're not abandoning it After Effects, but they're kind of combining the two a lot more. So hopefully that helps. With After Effects, you do get the free light version. You get a little bit of MoGraph in here. You get the plane effector, and I think a random effector. You don't get the cloner and all these other cool tools, but they give you a little bit of a taster of it, and you can do some simple modeling. You can't do the volumes modeling that we looked at, but you get some simple tools in there to get you going. Okay, any other questions? Thank you very much. Thanks for the video. Do you have to modify the tracking points individually if you want to go back and forth on, let's say, the Z-axis? I'm not sure what you mean. I mean, tracking normally is referred to as tracking footage, and we haven't looked at any of that sort of stuff, but you can track clips. You can run camera tracking, which is like After Effects does it, but it's more advanced in Cinema. You can do object tracking. So if you want to stick something on somebody's face, you can do an object track. You can do that. With regard to what we've done, I'm not entirely sure what you mean in terms of tracking. Maybe you mean tracking the movement here that I only moved on the X and Y. But of course, if I wanted to, I could go in and then add Z depth so the sphere is moving forwards and backwards as well. I could do that. Is it easy to add a camera if you wanted to pan around the car park scene as the spheres are moving? Well, I've actually got a camera in here, and I've actually added something called a protection tag, which is locking its position, because I don't want to move it forwards and backwards and left and right, but I can. I have unlocked the rotation, so if I wanted to, I could animate this. If I want to spin around. In fact, this demo, it was originally built for a 360 headset set, so I've got the camera set, but the final render there, you can watch that on a headset, and so the idea is that you move around and see the environment, and there's all these other things shooting out, going forwards and backwards. So yes, you can move around that scene. That could be animated in there as well. Any tips for creating 3D environment in Cinema 4D and applying it to green screen footage? There's an endless number of tips. To start with, you want to have a good reference of where all your lights are in your green screen footage, because keying something out is pretty straightforward to do in After Effects, but making it feel like it's integrated is largely about the compositing and largely about lighting. And so if you know, for example, this car park, if you were compositing someone in here, when you light the green screen, you definitely want to have a big light above lighting them, because that would feel much more natural. So that's a very important part of compositing them into the background. Like I said, if the camera was static, that's straightforward. If the camera was moving, you would need to run a motion tracker on the footage so it integrates into the shot as well. And then matching other things like color, temperature, grain, softness, those traditional compositing options you can do. When you render out in Cinema, if you didn't want to have the background rendered, then in your options here, you just make sure you render out with an alpha channel and export as a format that supports alpha channel, like TIFF or PNG, lots of other types there. So then if I render that one out, that's going to take a while, but if I render that out, that will render out. And if I have a look at my layer, I can see it's going to render an alpha channel as well, which means the background will not be visible inside of my compositing software, be it After Effects or Fusion or Nuke. So I can see it there. And then I'll say, actually, show me the alpha channel. And that's the alpha channel. So that's just going to have the spheres cut out. Okay. Any Look at that one. Is there a way to texture an object without making it editable? So if I make a new scene here, and so let's say I've got a cube like that, I can, I think as I showed a little bit earlier, I don't need to make it editable to texture it. But if I want to have different textures on there, then it's going to help. So, wrong channel. So, for example, I pop that on there. That's now all green. If I add another material to it, that's all pink. Pop that on there. Now I've got, this is how layers work in Cinema 4D. So I've got pink layer on top of a green layer. So if I select and delete the pink, I can see the green, and you know, vice versa. I put the green on top, I'll see the pink beneath. If I have a material like this green one here, I could make parts of it transparent, either using transparency or alpha. For example, if I enable an alpha channel, I could use something that will alpha, probably black and white would work best. So if I go to something like a checkerboard, you see the checkerboard there. I'll just increase the sizes of those. Now the checkerboard is revealing through, so everything that's white I'm seeing, everything that's not white is showing me the material underneath. So if you can see there, it's very, very small, but I can see that material, only parts of it are being shown up. The parts that are transparent are showing the material underneath, which in this case is the pink material. So I can mix textures using these methods here. If I've got an alpha channel on it, if I'm bringing in an image, maybe I've got a logo or something, like a Nike symbol, that's kind of easy to create, but something more complex than that. If it's got an alpha channel, I've saved it in a Photoshop file or a TIFF or something, then I can merge it in there, and everything that's transparent will show through what's underneath. So this is actually two materials that are merged together. And that's another way that I can have multiple materials on an object. Any good tips of how to get After Effects and Cinema 4D to work together? It really depends on what you're doing. If you're doing simple motion graphics, I don't think I really got time to do too much here, but if you're doing simple motion graphics, so you know, designs and objects, stuff that's not got, let's say, stuff that's not got things like global illumination or depth of field and stuff that will render relatively quickly, then all you need to do is open up your Cinema 4D scene file inside After Effects, and you can work with it straight in there. If you're using more advanced rendering systems, then it's kind of have to chug it through before it gets into After Effects, and that can be quite slow. So traditionally, for more you know, more complex scenes, you can view them through After Effects, but you tend to render them out as an image sequence and do your final composites in After Effects. But if you've got After Effects open, I can take any of my scenes that I've made and just import them just like a normal image. So if I go import desktop C4D webinar, where was my dice, grab dice, open that, that comes into After Effects. After it's spun around for a little while, put that into a new comp. And there I can see there's my model. It's not very high quality because I'm just on a software render. If I put it to final, let's see the final thing. That's obviously going to take a few more moments, and then I can see, there we go. Let's put that up to full quality. And so that's now got my Cinema 4D scene file with its rendering and lighting inside of After Effects. And if I would back, where is that scene? Dice here. If I was back here and I said, for example, oh yeah, I want to just duplicate that up. So I'll have another one, say over here, that's rotated round a bit like that, for example, and I save that. Then back in After Effects, give it a couple of moments, and it should update that Did I save it? Possibly I didn't. You do need to save it in Cinema 4D, which is what I forgot to do. So save project. And now After Effects is looking at that project. It's not looking at a render. It's not looking at previous version. So I can hear my fan kicking in because it's obviously having to process that through both bits of software. But once that's finished processing that, then I'll see both of those objects inside of After Effects. And that's useful, particularly if you're integrating a 3D work with some 2D work and you want to see how it looks without having to render it out, bring it in, think, oh, I should have moved the camera, oh, I should tweak the lighting. You can see straight away inside of After Effects. Of course, the faster, more powerful system you've got, the better. The more complex the scene, the more bottleneck there's going to be. But hopefully that gives you an idea. Oh, there we go. There we go. There's our two dice in the shot there. And there's loads of other stuff I can do inside of After Effects. For example, I can extract all the information, the 3D information. So if there's a camera and a light, I can bring that out into After Effects. I can extract passes. So if I want the shadows and the highlights and the global illumination, reflections, all as separate layers that I can then tweak and composite, I can extract them as well. Okay, hopefully that answers that one. So lots of integration with After Effects. You know, the caveat is it's system dependent. Do the cameras translate? Yes, they do. They speak very well to each other. In fact, if you make a scene in After Effects and have a camera moving in it, you can then, inside of After Effects, you can then go and export it and bring that into Cinema 4D. And likewise, if you've got a moving camera in Cinema 4D and you bring it into After Effects, you can extract it and then you've got the camera in After Effects. So yeah, they're both based on the same sort of camera information, which has got X, Y, and Z position and the 3D rotation properties. So they come across, so things that come across really well are cameras, lights, null objects. They're the main ones, but then there's also a lot of interaction with After Effects these days with sending text. So if you send a text layer over to After Effects, from After Effects to Cinema, it will automatically make it 3D and add extrusion to it. And that's a much quicker way of working. You might have noticed if you're an After Effects user, in the latest version, they have got rid of the ray trace renderer that used to be here, just because it's slow, and they've just kind of said, you know, if you can't beat them, join them. So Cinema 4D is the way that we do our 3D stuff now, because it's just much better. Okay, I think we're pretty much out of time now. Let me have a quick look if there's anything urgent. I do apologize if I've missed anyone's urgent requests. I mean, there's so much stuff in, I mean, I could go on for days on this, basically. There's so much stuff you can do in Cinema, and they're just constantly adding more and more to it. Of course, there's plugins you can get. We talked about Redshift and Octane. X Particles is the particles, you know, is a very intelligent particle system, but there's lots of inbuilt particles within Cinema 4D. Like I said, motion capture, there's also character animation stuff. I think we'll probably have to do some more of these webinars because there's so much cool stuff to show you. But I think we're out of time. But thank you very much, everyone, for tuning in. And if you've got more questions, do shoot us an email, and hopefully either see you on another one of these or on a course that's coming soon. Okay, thank you very much. Bye now.